Welcome everybody to the first class of Virtual Reality 201 here at FX PhD, and I'm really excited to have Scott Squires joining us for this and other classes throughout the term. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
So the idea behind this first class is to kind of give you an understanding of why we're treating the subject matter, working with the subject matter we are, which is monoscopic live action VR, spherical VR. And I think an important point to remember during this process is we like to focus on the art and the craft, but there is a bit of commerce based in this.
Sure.
We need to make money in order to get the job done. And there's one guy who I know who's actually done more VR projects in the last year than anyone I know, from a wide variety, from CG-based products utilizing game engines and apps, to live action utilizing red rigs, GoPro rigs, moving cameras, the mix, and that's Lucas Wilson. So that'd be great to have him in to kind of give us an update on the state of the business, because I think that's really important for all of you who are watching to kind of understand where it's at right now, where the business opportunities are, and what it really means. And I started out by asking Lucas, what is the state of VR production from a business standpoint right now?
VR is interesting right now because it's still the early part of the curve. It's a shiny object, so lots of people want to get into it and everybody hears VR. It's interesting though because everybody wants to do one, right? Across every creative discipline, across every kind of project, whether it's short form, commercials, music videos, corporate industrial, episodic, even into features. Everybody wants to do one just to see what it's like. The market will be determined by how many people want to do two. But right now, the kind of work that I'm seeing is really all across everything that you'd expect it to be. I'm getting calls for commercials. I'm getting calls for music videos, sort of independent product videos, infomercials, episodic. People are starting to get into dramatic and figure out what that means, as well as pure art pieces. Game companies are obviously into VR for the gaming portion, but because they're into VR for the gaming portion, they're also getting into the live action aspects and trying to record live action VR. So it's a little bit of everything, honestly, right now.
From a technology standpoint, what's the end product in general? Is there a trend right now? Is it monoscopic? Is it stereoscopic, like stuff like the Jaunt? Is it gaming engine, or just combination of all those?
It's a combination of everything. When people call up, they want 360 stereo, 8K, 16K delivered on everything because they don't know, right? But that's one of the first discussions I have with people when they call me, when they start talking to me, because they just want a VR project. They don't really know what that means most of the time. So one of the first discussions I have to have is mono, stereo, that sort of thing. But right now, honestly, the calls that I'm getting, people just want a VR project.
Okay.
And then it's a tremendous education process after that.
So then, from your standpoint, you end up steering them a certain direction based upon their creative, obviously. I imagine budget, I imagine timetable, all those things have impact in how you advise them.
VR, forget about the shiny object nature of VR. VR is just a creative deliverable. It's just a creative deliverable. There are rules that you have to follow just like you would with any other creative deliverable. If somebody comes to you and they want a video, you're going to ask them a bunch of questions about, okay, what's this for? What's your budget? What are you trying to shoot on? What's your goals? You ask a bunch of questions to help clients narrow in to what they really want, and then you go from there. VR is no different. It's still a creative process. It's still a creative project, and you have to deal with clients in the same way to get them to an end goal.
From the consideration then of, let's say, okay, I'm doing commercial, I want as many people to see it as possible at this point in time. What's your recommendation?
It's a good question, because one of the questions that people want to do a VR project, right? And they're like, okay, we want a bunch of people to see it, and I always ask, okay, one of the big questions that people have is we want to do a live VR broadcast, which there are companies out there that are doing live VR and doing it successfully and doing it well. But my question is always, who's going to see it? Right? Who's going to pick up you're doing a live VR broadcast? That's great. Who's going to pick up one of these devices at the end of the day and watch your live VR broadcast at that time, right? So it's a really good question as to what are the distribution platforms right now. If I had to pick one right now that I would say is consistent and is something that's being regularly fed as a channel, as channels and is regularly getting new content, it's probably Samsung's Milk VR platform.
Right.
The Gear VRs there's still not a ton of them. They're still a little bit expensive. It's still very much an enthusiast market, but Samsung is doing the right things, I think, to build a good distribution platform. So if I had to deliver it to one place right now, I'd deliver it to Milk VR.
And the fact is, people aren't spending a ton of money because they've already invested a tremendous investment in their phone in comparison to actually having a piece of comfortable headset to wear, unlike the cardboard, which is not so comfortable and better for short bites. Actually, it's really fantastic for that.
But it's interesting though, because at the end of the day, and not a lot of people realize this, but at the end of the day, you are either delivering an app, you're either delivering a custom app that has video or it has some kind of VR experience in that app. And at that point, you're into, again, forget about VR, remove that sort of buzzword aspect to it. At that point, you're getting into your company with an app, and you're dealing with the metrics of app marketing, app distribution, how you get it on the store, how you promote that app. It's just an app, right? And how do you get that to people? So that's a traditional audience marketing problem that's pretty well understood and needs to be approached that way. So you're either delivering an app or you're delivering a video. And not a lot of people realize this, but when you're delivering VR as video, it's just an MP4. The geometry that's inside of it, how it's formatted, how the raster is formatted within that MP4 is unusual, but it's just an MP4. And as an MP4, you're delivering it to a couple of different online platforms and a couple of different online places, and it's a question of making sure all those boxes are ticked.
Taking a look at that, what's the reality regarding budgets out there? Because at this point in time, certain types of VR can be incredibly time consuming to do, like stereoscopic with a moving camera is really, really hard, right? What are you seeing budget-wise, just in general terms out there?
Gosh, budgets are honestly the same as they are for when somebody calls you up to do a video, right?
Okay.
I have people calling me up to do VR. Generally, the low end right now is around 50,000 US. I can see that sort of establishing itself as the low end. When people call me and they have a preconceived number in mind, the low end of that preconceived number is around 50,000, all in, right? And sometimes that's possible, and sometimes it's not. But from there on up, I see everything from 50,000 up to several hundred thousand and around a million plus at the high end.
Wow, and does that vary based upon the complexity of the project? For instance, doing a video, doing the standard MP4 style video versus a complete interactive game using some kind of game engine obviously would take much more time and money.
It is dependent on, again, because VR is in its early days and there's still a lot of hype attached to it, the budget numbers are attached to some reality, but some of it is attached to, we have somebody, a large company comes in and says, we have this much money to spend, we want a really good VR experience and we have this much money. And there's not really any reality attached to it. It's just in their product marketing budget or in some budgeting process somewhere, they have assigned this much and they want VR because it's a buzzword. So the budgets are somewhat based in reality and somewhat based in hype.
And the reality is, and I'm talking to people, just the number of headsets out there really isn't all that great. Obviously with YouTube and other things, you can actually view some of them on the computer. But is there certain aspect of doing a VR project that's actually just about doing a VR project from a marketing standpoint? In other words, as a company saying, hey, we've got this really cool VR thing that we did. The fact that they did a VR project as the marketing idea, not the actual VR content itself, but basically saying, hey, you know what? I did a VR project, we're amazing. That's
a good point. A lot of people want, I haven't done a single job yet where just the fact that that company has done a VR project is not part of sort of the end goal.
Right.
Just to be able to raise their hand and say, we have done a VR project, it's part of and that implies we're a forward-thinking company in terms of creative strategy and in terms of visual strategy.
Yeah, I don't mean that in a cynical way. It's actually, at this point in time, it's actually an important distinction for companies.
It is, and it's not just hype, and it's not just cynical. I mean, a company who is thinking about doing VR, who's actively thinking about doing VR or AR, is a company that's actively thinking about, okay, what are new and interesting creative ways that we can reach our audience? And sometimes VR is, it's just like a video, right? Sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not.
Okay, so for the folks who are watching this course, we're going to be working through a monoscopic video piece. From your standpoint, what are the opportunities out there for visual artists, visual effects artists, and post houses right now within the industry?
Good question. For doing monoscopic VR, I would say that it's a wide open field right now, and there's actually a lot of opportunity. In terms of building an overall workflow for doing a VR job, the biggest consistent problem in terms of budgeting and in terms of execution is stitching. In dealing with doing what I call dailies quality stitching is fairly straightforward. There are a couple of different programs that do it, and it doesn't take an expert amount of knowledge to be able to do that. And the biggest problem is in doing what I call final quality stitching. And it's a known problem. Visual effects artists all around the world know how to do it, and building 360 worlds and building that kind of environment is known, right? This is not something that's brand new to VFX artists, but turning VR into a knowable process that's able to be consistent and is able to be budgeted on a per minute or per hour or some kind of reality basis is the biggest challenge I have right now. And I'm working with a couple of different companies that are actively figuring out really good pipelines for turning that into a business, so that I can just call them up and say, okay, I have a job based on this rig, it's going to be about this kind of thing, what's it going to cost? And I can get a number based in reality that they're making money and it's just a real number for budgeting. So that's opportunity number one, is in building good stitching pipelines. It's not sexy work, but it's necessary. And at the end of the day, though, I think it's only, that particular piece is only an opportunity for a short amount of time, because there's really absolutely no reason that stitching should be a manual process. There's just none. It's a manual process right now because of the nature of the industry and the nature of the fact that it's brand new. And camera rigs are brand new and everybody's sort of figuring it out. But stitching should be something that's done by the camera, whatever that happens to be, right? The same way that you saw high-end digital camera manufacturers, originally they were releasing RAW, right? They were releasing their own RAW files. And eventually, every single camera manufacturer said, okay, well, we're going to output ProRes at the same time, or we're going to output DNX at the same time. Because that transcoding step, it shouldn't be something that requires manual intervention. Same thing for stitching. So very long answer to that particular thing. Another big opportunity, a couple of big opportunities. Editorial. I'm working with several different editorial houses right now, learning the language of VR and learning the language of how you cut a story, how you cut short form, how you cut long form, and working within VR is a brand new opportunity. There's a misnomer out there. A lot of people think that you can't cut in VR, that you just put the camera there and it just has to stay there and you build a performance around it. That's crap. You can cut in VR, you can dissolve in VR, you can do all the things that you do in a normal video deliverable in VR. It's just a new medium, so you have to treat it carefully. So editorial, motion graphics is a huge area of opportunity because motion graphics is everywhere. It's in intros, it's in outros, it's just everywhere. The same thing, again, so much of this relates back to doing video or to doing film deliverables. Think of all the places that VR lives in those projects. They live in the same places in VR projects, and there are very few people that know how to do motion graphics and know how to do them well and are thinking about how to do them in a 360 space so that it's cool, right? So that it's a neat deliverable. That's a huge area of opportunity. I would love to be able to have more people that I could call to do 360 motion graphics. And then just traditional visual effects work, right? I did a job for a game company not too long ago that there were a ton of bullets and tracers and all sorts of those kinds of weapons-based effects, right? Being able to do those well and crank them up, that's hard in a 360 world. So for visual effects artists, I would say the biggest area of opportunity is just familiarize yourself with how to work in a 360 world, how to do stitching, how to do motion graphics, and how to do just plain old visual effects.
It's applying the techniques that you already know in general, the core creative techniques to a new technology,
exactly.
Effectively, right?
Exactly.
All right, so I'm going to post, many of our members are at small to medium sized post houses and so forth, but I'm sure they're getting people calling them about a job. You know, one of their favorite clients in the ad agency may be saying, hey, you know, we'd really like to do this VR thing. From your standpoint, in an ideal world, how should they respond to that? What workflow should they set up? Because they may be leading from production all the way through post, audio, and delivery.
Well, I would say it's a great opportunity for post houses in general right now, because 99 times out of 100, when a client calls you right now, this may change in 6 months as people get more educated in the process. 99 times out of 100, when somebody calls you and says, we want to do a VR job, can you help us? They have no idea what that means.
Okay.
They just know they want to do a VR job, right? But they probably haven't started really figuring out what that means. Or if they have, they've only gotten a piece of it, right? They know how to acquire maybe, but they don't know how to stitch. They don't know how to do audio. They don't know the deliverables. They don't know where it goes. They don't know how to package it. So it's a tremendous area of opportunity right now for post houses to learn and to say, okay, what do you mean when you say you're doing a VR job? And then get into that discussion and establish themselves as subject matter experts, so their clients can say, oh, wow, that's a lot of stuff. Okay, well, clearly you know what you're doing, so we're going to go to you to do this stuff, right? And the thing is that what I found right now is that VR is so new that clients in general, from the $50,000 clients to the $1 million clients, they're not expecting anybody to be the sole expert on this because they know it's brand new. So there's a lot of tolerance in the ability to have the discussion of, hey, we know, okay, let's learn about this together, right? We're your post guys, you know, and we can figure this out, but let's learn this together and let's step through this and we will hold your hand and figure it out.
So in the case, let's see, someone knows many people post houses, they have Red camera gear, they could fairly affordably get a GoPro rig, well, with all the issues that are involved in a GoPro 360 rig or whatever, but they do audio, they do everything. Does it make sense to try and do that all in-house in general, or do you try and find specialists to help you with that process? I mean, it's probably easier to do here in LA than it would be, say, in Berlin or Amsterdam, maybe.
Right. The VR is just a process. Like anything else, it's just a process. Having worked for manufacturers for a long time, I see the same cycle happen, and I was in the 3D world professionally for a long time as well. I see the same cycle happen when any new technology emerges in the creative markets. There's always a group of people that sort of raise their hands first that I'll call them the secret sauce brigade, right? And those are people that have figured something out, and they say, no, this is very special, very secret knowledge, it's very, very hard, and you need to come to us because we're the only people that know how to do it, and you're going to pay us a lot of money, but we're not going to tell you anything about what we're doing. You're going to pay us a lot of money, it goes into the black box, okay, and we give you something at the end, and it's magic, right? There's no magic to it, you know? That sort of thinking, and everybody knows what I'm talking about, you know, and that sort of thinking works, and people that are able to capitalize on that and be opportunistic enough to do that succeed for a short amount of time until everybody realizes there's no magic to it. It's just a process, right? VR is the same thing, whether you're in Berlin or Indianapolis or Amsterdam or Los Angeles. It's just a process. You figure out your shooting solution. You shoot with multiple cameras in a rig. Those multiple cameras in a rig are all individual pieces of media. Those individual pieces of media have to be stitched into a single piece of media. There are different programs that do that. Get to know those programs and understand them so that you can do a stitch. Then once that stitch happens, then it goes through a standard. At the point that it's stitched, they're just video files. The geometry in them is a little unusual, but they're just video files. They're ProRes or they're DNX or they're whatever, right? At that point, edit. At that point, go into Premiere or Final Cut or Media Composer or whatever, and just edit your project. Then once you're done editing your project, then there is a conform step, and this is an unusual step. There's a conform step, but when you're conforming, you're going back to not just one camera master, you're going back to all the camera masters. Right. And then you have to go back to all those camera masters and reconform to all those camera masters to pull selects, so that then you're pulling those selects and then you're doing the final quality stitch. Mm-hmm. And then from that final quality stitch, then you do DI, right? And there are tools Assimilate's Scratch program is still the only tool right now that's a DI tool that you can grade to the Oculus Rift, right? I've now booked and been in several supervised DI sessions where the director is wearing a Rift and the colorist is on the box, and that colorist client exchange is the same, but instead of looking at a theater or looking at a secondary monitor, the director's looking at an Oculus Rift. So it's a very long answer, but then those are the steps for post. Then there's the DI, and then there's understanding what the deliverables are, right? And the same way that if you're dealing with the networks, you have a delivery book, right? You have your book of here's how you need to format your deliverables. Same thing. There are certain places right now that VR video and VR content is distributed. You have to understand what those places are, what the rules are for distributing to those places, and make your deliverables.
Right. Okay, so you have probably been involved with more VR projects than anyone I know at production level, especially the breadth of them, the types of them. For our people who are watching this, someone comes to the post facility, what would your recommendation be? And obviously creative has something to do with it, okay? But what would your recommendation be for someone doing their first project? Do you think having them tackle stereo is a good idea right off the bat? No. Do you think tackling a moving camera right off the bat? But do you have any suggestion from that somewhere? What is a sensible starting point to learn the fundamentals of what they need to build the next step to do bigger projects?
From a client side or from a post house side?
That's both.
Okay. First of all, there's the argument right now of mono versus stereo. Mm-hmm. I'll settle that once and for all right now. Anybody that's been in stereo for any length of time knows how hard it is to do stereo with just two cameras, right? Just a left eye and a right eye. Everybody knows how hard it is to do. Anybody who's been in stereo for any length of time knows that stereo is hard. Making good-looking stereo is hard. In VR, it's infinitely more hard. My personal recommendation is, unless you're working with Jaunt or unless you're working with a camera company or an acquisition provider that is doing the stereo for you, then shoot mono. Because doing stereo practically, if you're trying to do it on your own, doing stereo practically, I can almost guarantee you that unless you have a tremendous amount of money to spend, it's going to look bad.
And to be clear, we're talking about live action here, just to be clear, right?
We are
because
talking
it's
about
a different beast for computer generated.
Absolutely. Right? Everything that I'm talking about in this entire talk is about live action. Right. So now there are people, if someone comes to me and says, we absolutely have to have a stereo project, then, okay, great, you absolutely have to have a stereo project. Then my two options, at least in my mind, my two options are, realistically, unless they have an unlimited budget, which, that happens so much these days.
Right.
My options are I either call up Jaunt, or I call up a company that is going to do the stereo for me, or I shoot mono and call up Legend or a conversion company, shoot mono and then convert, because that's a known process and those people are very good at it.
Right, and it's been a process that's been proven over the last several years.
So let's put mono and stereo. That's how I handle mono and stereo right now. And in terms of shooting and what you shoot and how you shoot, honestly, it's a wide open world right now, right? It's pretty cool because there kind of are no rules in VR right now. You try stuff and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And the things that people say, oh no, you can't do that. Then you try it and you're like, well, yes, you can. You just have to be careful, right? It's the same thing as shooting with any other new medium. When Reds first came out and there was a super high resolution digital camera, people tried all sorts of wacky stuff. And some things work and some things don't. It's a new medium. Shoot, test, understand what the new medium is, and go from there.
Well, I thought that was a really interesting interview with Lucas, kind of giving his perspective, because he's done so many projects.
Sure, that's definitely the case, because this is the early days of VR. It's important to have basic knowledge, so when a client comes in, at least you can respond correctly. And I think that's what we're trying to look at here is try to get people up to at least the basics of VR and to have that knowledge base, because if you have that knowledge, then of course the clients will be willing to give you the project.
So let's start out talking about why we're focusing now more specifically on monoscopic VR for this class. You know, like I said, we had the boot camp, and now we're going to dive into production.
Sure.
But let's start out with just a couple of creative issues, I think, that have to do with it, or experience issues when you put on a headset.
Right.
And a key one is the physical impact that it has on you when you experience poor VR.
Sure. Well, one thing as a filmmaker, since I've done like ride films, you think, okay, we'll just approach this and do camera moves and other types of interesting things. But then you discover once you start doing VR and looking at a lot of VR, so that you can actually make people have headaches or get nauseous, even people who aren't susceptible to motion sickness. Because if you've got bad camera motion or bad stereo and other types of things, all of that can have an actual impact that lasts for hours.
Yeah, and I think Mike mentioned that he actually had that experience. I know talking to him, he was out for the day,
Right.
actually. I mean, that's significant, and I've experienced it myself. There are a couple of videos where the camera is moving very jerky manner, the horizon's not level, and so you don't have that context, and it basically has a possibility of actually souring people on the VR experience.
Right, definitely. And I think next episode we'll be talking more about some of the creatives and things that people have to think about, but it is something different, and that's why we want to start with the basics at this point, is to go over so that at least, and that's why it was deemed, one of the reasons for going to mono was because stereo has the impact of making even the sickness worse, because if you have a lot of stereo disparity between them or other stereo issues, that just tends to make the mind go crazy at that point.
Okay, well, let's work through now some of the other possibilities that we could have done
Sure.
in this first class or course that we're doing. Because again, I think it'll be important for all of you who are watching to actually relate these to your clients, or at least understand them so you can actually help them make the right decision in the process going forward. Okay, so you can do CGI in stereo. In many ways, that's actually pretty interesting because you can create some really compelling and engaging content.
Right.
And due to its nature of being CG, it's a lot easier to overcome some of the things we're going to talk about in a minute about live action, because you can actually create your own rigs and so forth. But what are the varieties of CG that you could actually execute?
Well, basically it breaks down to two different types of computer graphics. You've got the real-time, which is typically done with either Unity game engine or the Unreal game engine. And so the idea is that you're generating it just like an actual video game in real time. Now, the downside to the, well, I guess first off, the upside is you can move your head all around. The other thing is with some of the rigs such as the Oculus, as well as the Vive, certainly with the Oculus you can move your head transitional, and then with the Vive you can actually walk around in like a 15 by 15 foot space.
Right.
And with the real-time computer graphics you can do all of that. And you can tilt your head and do all the other things and look up and see stereo wherever you go.
Because it is being generated on the fly, taking your motion into account, and so it can actually move the camera viewpoint through the scene on the fly for you.
Exactly, exactly. But the downside to real-time graphics, I mean, the other thing, of course, is you've got interaction.
Yes.
And you may have hand gesture devices or other game devices to control things and do just like a regular video game. But the downside of all of that is you have to generate stereo image at 60 to 90 frames per second. And especially for mobile devices, that means that you have a limited resolution that you can do. And even for the boxes, you know, the high-end PCs and so forth, there's a limit to how much resolution you can generate. So then the other side of CG for VR purposes is to pre-render it. And the advantage there, just like with film visual effects, you can get a lot of detail in. The disadvantage, of course, you give up a lot of that interactivity, and you give up some of the things like the translational motion and so forth that you get with the real time. So everything's a trade-off right now, as with most things with VR.
Yeah, exactly. And that's an interesting point about your camera viewpoint being locked in. You're only going to be able to get that up and down or left or right motion when you're viewing.
Right.
Okay, so that's CGI, both pre-rendered and on-the-fly rendering. Let's move now back to live action, okay? And talk about stereo. and kind of why we're not doing stereo. Right. First of all, it's actually really, really hard to do effective stereo in VR right now as we speak, right? Right. And one of those considerations is simply double the number of cameras. I mean, you have a higher cost because you have more cameras. Right. Frankly, on set, you have more points of data failure than you do actually with a lesser rig. And then, I think as you pointed out, just the amount of data that you generate from these cameras can be really expensive. Sure. Maybe less so for Reds, but or for GoPros, but more for Red rigs.
Right. Well, you know, even going from normal filming to stereo by itself is a difficult task and doubles your data and the rest of it. And so in the case of VR, you're now taking 6 cameras and turning into 12 cameras or 14, depending upon the type of rig that you have typically. In some cases with the Reds, you can have 6 cameras, but then there's trade-offs with all of those. But stereo is definitely difficult. I mean, I've only seen less than a handful of actual good stereo representation in live action because it's so difficult to get everything aligned. Just regular VR is tough to do and trying to take care of the seams and the rest of the problems. Whereas once you get into stereo, you have the problem of not only those seams, but the stereo disparity between cameras and between sections of the scenes.
Yeah, it's really hard. So we take this is a standard monoscopic GoPro rig. There are various versions of these that we see from various manufacturers. And these cameras are actually pretty tight together, relatively speaking. So when you film with this, you actually don't get very much parallax. You get some, and especially when you're close to the camera, sure. The further away from the camera you move, the better. But with even just a stereo GoPro rig, you're basically widening out that circle even further, introducing more parallax, which means more headaches in post.
Right. Well, now I guess the other thing that should be pointed out is all the commercially available software right now makes the assumption everything's without parallax. Right. Like you're on a perfect nodal point, as
Good luck with that.
So even with this type of rig, you will have some seaming going on, and that's why you're fighting in post. But once you get into stereo, as you say, once you get a bigger rig, then it becomes even more difficult. And the other problem is the stereo or the stitching software does not understand stereo. I mean, most of them are set up so that they're just treating each eye as just another 6-camera rig or right. whatever it is, whereas that can lead to some real continuity issues in terms of the stereo.
And coming down the road, hopefully some of that will change with some of the work that the Foundry is doing. Of course, right. You know, they have a nice heritage of actually working with that sure. through their Oculus techniques. But right now, we're talking right now as we're recording this class. That's the state of
sure.
where we're at.
You know, there have been some announcements. It seems like every few weeks of a new camera system going to be shown at some point. But right now, you know, the idea would be to start with the mono just because of the difficulties achieved. Now, certainly stereo gives you a much greater sense of presence when it's done well because you're really there, and certainly with the head mounts, you can see real stereo as opposed to just the goggles or glasses at a normal theater. But for right now, we thought it would be best to start with the mono because you're going to use that and apply it even if you do stereo in the future, but that's a good starting point, and that way you have much greater success chance.
Yeah, and a better way to learn and get a leg up on people who are learning all about this. Now, so we talked about the the distance between these cameras and expanding with the stereo rig for GoPro, but then as you mentioned as well, if you take Red cameras, that gets even worse throughout this area. But one of the other problems I want to touch on with this that you don't get necessarily with the Red rigs is synchronization. Synchronization is, well, impossible with this right now.
Well, the problem is you get, right now, all these camera systems are really just rigs. They're not truly designed from scratch cameras for doing VR purposes. So most of it falls into either GoPro rigs or Red rigs. Now, the GoPros, their advantages are, of course, their lower price point. They're fairly compact, you know, and readily available. The disadvantage is you don't have any syncing. And that's a problem with the 6-camera rig or any multi-camera rig, whether it's 2 or 12, 14, is when something goes from one, you've got a bouncing ball or somebody walking between, they're going to be slightly out of sync. They can be up to half a frame out of sync. And the problem is, once again, when you go to stereo and those are out of sync, then you have some real problems because your eye is going crazy from looking at both of those scenes at the same time. The other problem, of course, with the GoPros is they have automatic exposure and so forth, so you have no control over those types of aspects. You also are fixed with their lenses and the way they've got it set up and so forth, which the Reds give you. They give you the ability to synchronize, and they give you full control over the lens and exposure and so forth. And those right now are the trade-offs.
Yeah, and there certainly are trade-offs. Wider distance between the cameras, more parallax, but in sync, higher quality,
right?
Maybe easier to work with from a color standpoint. The other thing, and this holds true for both, obviously, mono and stereo rigs. It's a lot easier to move this. Now, we talked about be careful about movement, but you can move in VR. It's not a problem. You just need to do it adequately, and this is a heck of a lot easier than a large array of R3 red cameras around.
Yes.
So, then the other thing is, what do you think about the idea? We're all in visual effects, or many of us are in visual effects. The idea that seems to be good, which is creating the stereo in post. Shoot a single camera rig and create the stereo in post. They do it for feature films. Why not for VR?
Sure. Well, and that's, as we talked about previously, the complexity of even just shooting the normal movie in stereo is such that a lot of productions say, we don't want to bother with this, and we don't want to make decisions, we'll pass that on to post-production. So same thing applies to this. It is possible to do, and some companies are ramping up. I know Legend and Prey, others are ramping up to do VR stereo, and that's an opportunity or a possibility. Obviously, just like the normal conversion process, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of expense to do that type of thing. So once again, you're looking at different types of trade-offs. So that's an option. It just, obviously, if you can capture it in camera, but as we say, that's not really a great option right now either.
Yeah, so actually one of the things that we talk about capturing in camera, it's interesting. There's a 360 Heroes rig that befuddles me.
Okay, sure.
And I think you know which one I'm talking about. It's the arrangement of stereo pairs, and then I believe stereo pairs rotate on the top and bottom.
Right.
That's useless.
Well, the problem is, and that we should probably touch on that since we're talking about stereo, is when you look up with that stereotype of system, it will work as long as you're lined up exactly on stereo. Now, as you rotate your head, which you do when you have the headsets on, if you rotate a full 180, now the stereo's backwards.
Right.
So what's typically done is you feather out the stereo as it goes towards the top on any pre-rendered or video type of thing. Once again, your real-time computer graphics, they can handle that, but anything pre-rendered, you have issues looking up.
Yeah, and actually we did an interview with Murata, who actually utilized the Jaunt rig, and they actually have a whole renderer set up on their system that will go out and actually pixel by pixel go out and render the CGs so that it marches in the disparity as it marches to the top of the apex and then back out and then back down. It's a special shader that they wrote to actually work around that problem.
Right. And that's even with the pre-rendered type of shaders built into some of the newer software 3D packages. They do something similar in terms of that. There is a patent or a research paper trying to keep that stereo alive, but right now there are issues with trying to do that.
So a lot of problems with stereo right now, and you can see hopefully why we chose at this point not to do it. But there is hope on the horizon. I mean, this is changing so quickly.
Sure.
Jaunt just actually recently announced that they're going to have a new camera coming out.
Right. Well, and part of that, according to the press release, is a light field camera, which Otoy and some other companies are working on. Light field cameras, and that's very exciting, assuming those come to fruition, just because you're able to record bunch of data, but you can also make certain translational motions with those, and you can actually turn your head or look up and down and continue with the full stereo in any orientation. That's the possibility, or that's the hope or premise of that. But you're also recording typically a lot more data to begin with, and it's kind of a different rig and different post-production pipeline at that point. So, and those are not readily available right now, you know. So once again, I think the thing is we're looking at this as, here's how to start today, right? And in the future, another class we may have cover stereo or even a light field camera at some point.
Well, in fact, as we sat down together last week and went over this with Alex, we actually left class number 10 in there for hopefully future tech and things that might come out, because actually in theory the John camera will be around or seen in public before we actually finish out this term in this course. All right, so I guess just to recap again, you've touched on it a bit. Why mono? Why did we choose to do this? And first of all, it's basically the learning process. It's the core skills you need to know. And I mean, I think Alex brought up a good point about having a pool of artists who actually know the basics.
Right. Well, as we talked about, right now, the majority of the videos out there and that you see on YouTube and so forth, 360, are all mono. Because it is a much more straightforward process and pipeline, because you do get much better quality at this point. Because the other thing that we didn't touch on with the doing stereo on the headsets is you have to either compress, you're doing side by side, or vertical, so you're ending up losing some resolution. And especially in the Gear VR, you're already fighting resolution issues. So with all of that in mind, the majority right now is mono. Everything that you learn and deal with on mono, how to stitch, how to avoid the, seeing the rig and all those types of things, and designing your shots, pretty much apply to the stereo. So I just look at this as a starting point for anybody, and that covers the majority of the work now.
Yeah, we certainly have plans here at FX PhD to dive into more. I'll make no secret the earliest leak ever is we're planning to continue this on term after term and build in complexity. But for now, this is the way to go. The other thing about doing it mono is we want our members to be able to go out and try to do this themselves. Actually, that's going to be part of the creative that we're going to talk about next week, and we want it to be affordable for you to do that. So the cost of production is frankly lower, because you can go out and rent for the week if you need to 6 GoPros, and this is a fairly affordable rig. We're also actually going to show you some really cool setups, which I think is great because, once again, all of us as visual effects artists and visual effects background are used to putting together multiple passes. So you can actually do a 360 VR with one camera. And actually, in many ways, as you'll see, it can be easier.
Right. And you can, for visual effects people, we're also used to thinking in terms of locked off cameras and clean plates and those types of things. And so we can take advantage of some of those same issues with, especially the lock off 360 rigs, or as you say, just with even a single rig, and looking at the same way as we would shoot plates or even a light reference a lot of times, and building up those plates.
Well, again, we just want to give you an overview in this first class. We got some hardcore business information, and hopefully in this last part of the class, actually some information that helps you understand that you can read to your clients about the pluses and minuses at today, July 2015, of where we're at in VR to help you out with that. And what's going to happen now for the rest of the course is we're going to start working through the project that we talked about. We're going to have a creative idea. It's going to have an idea that will hopefully be able to involve you guys. Our hope being that you will contribute your own VR scenes to this overall project, and we can have a bit of a showcase. But I think, again, the important thing is you can't really understand it until you go out and do it yourself. I mean, I think like the case of anything, it's really the best way to do it. So we're going to have some various options of that. We're going to show you some high end, some low end. But we're going to pick that up next week when we start talking about our creative, because just like we said, when you meet with your client, in the end, it's actually the creative that drives how you accomplish things in post, and VR is no exception.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think this is going to be a good ramp up. We're trying not to make things too complicated, but interesting nonetheless. And I think that's a good backbone for the entire project here.
Well, hey, Scott, thanks so much for this first class, and thank all of you for being part of FX PhD, watching this. If you have any questions, drop by the forums. I'm there, Scott's there. I'm sure some of you have seen him posting before in the forums. Until next week, thanks for being a part of FX PhD. See ya.